Okay, everyone, it's 1:30, so I'll get started with our introduction. First of all, welcome to all of you for our presentation this afternoon by Dr. Thelma Jackson, um, entitled The Presence of Blacks in Thurston County. My name is Greg Griffith with the Olympia Historical Society, Bigelow House Museum. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to our presentation this afternoon. I'm sure it will be a great one. Um, Before, though, we get started, I wanted to sort of go through some of the ground rules. It's been a year now since we've been Zooming, but just to go over some of the ground rules for our presentation this afternoon before we get to our introduction to Dr. Jackson. So first of all, welcome to our Zoom. You are all will be muted during the presentation. I want to acknowledge our Zoom master, Ben Helly, who is at the controls for this afternoon's presentation. So thank you, Ben, for your help on this. He will be muting all of you during the presentation, so there's no distractions or errand kinds of conversations that might interrupt the flow of the conversation this afternoon. So we appreciate your cooperation with that. Also, want to mention that we will be recording the presentation by Dr. Jackson this afternoon. So just a reminder that if you do not want to have your photo, your picture, when we post this eventually on YouTube, you might want to stop your video presentation if that's a concern for you. We do eventually hope to post the presentation on our YouTube channel at some point in the future once we get that all kind of edited and posted. But just want to remind you, if you don't want your picture on the recording, you can stop your video. Although you're welcome to keep your picture on if you'd like to. Also, I wanted to mention to you that Dr. Jackson is very interested in having a conversation with all of you and taking questions after her remarks are done. So if you do have questions during the presentation or after, simply put them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them after her remarks are done. We'll go through those. I'll be reading those from the chat box and then presenting those to Dr. Jackson to respond to all of you. So she's looking forward to having this conversation and engagement with all of you. So with that, then let me read an introduction to Dr. Jackson and our presentation this afternoon. So Dr. Jackson has lived in the Lacey area for 50 years after having grown up in the deep South state of Alabama. She has seen many changes since arriving in Washington State in 1968 and here in Thurston County in 1971. Thelma has been deeply involved in various aspects of the community, serving on numerous boards, commissions, task force, and committees. Locally, she served on the North Thurston School Board for 20 years, the Board of Trustees of the Evergreen State College, Washington State Legislative Ethics Board, and the Leadership Thurston County Board of Directors, to name just a few, and numerous other involvements over the years. Over the past 10 years, she has become an avid purveyor of Black history with a key focus on Thurston County and Washington State. Today, she shares with us her most current involvement with a project that documents the migration of Black people into Thurston County between 1950 and 1975. It states that Thurston County has been an interesting place to live and work. She's proud of the accomplishments of her family, which includes her husband, Nat, of 54 years, and their three children, who are all college graduates with successful entrepreneurial careers. They have four adult granddaughters who are the joys of their lives. Thelma recently retired from her consulting business after 35 years, and in her, quote, spare time, unquote, she enjoys gardening of both flowers and organic vegetables. Her post-secondary education includes a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry and a doctorate in educational leadership and change. So with that, thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, for being with us this afternoon, and welcome to our presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to express my thanks to the Olympia Historical Society and Bigelow House Museum for this opportunity today. My colleagues and I look forward to completing this project. Briefly, the outline provides the layout of this presentation. And given the time that we have today, I just want to start by giving you a brief overview of the Oral Black History Project, some information about the early Blacks in Thurston County that ties the pieces together, historical reflection of the US prior to the 1950s, a surge of the Civil Rights Movement and how that came about, then the migration of Blacks into Thurston County prior to 1950. We'll talk a little bit about some of the census records that have been somewhat difficult to come by, but begin to shed some light on this subject. And we'll get into the whole issue of migration of Blacks during 1950 to 1975. I'll highlight some of the data and information that's emerging from the interviews that's been key to this project. Then I'll provide a few closing remarks, and then we'll have the audience participation. The presence of Blacks in Thurston County is becoming increasingly documented for the 19th century, but little is known about our presence between 1900 and 1950. The story about the settlement of the Bush family in Tumwater is the most familiar information about early Blacks in Thurston County. There were, however, a number of others that not much is known about between the early 1900s and the 1950s. That 50-year span needs to be researched, and hopefully that gap can be filled as time goes on. In the meantime, efforts are currently underway to document the presence of Blacks from 1950 to 1975, a group many of which were still alive when this project began and had been available for oral interviews. This oral history project is slated to be completed by the end of this year, 2021. I will be sharing some of the themes that emerged from these interviews. First, let me establish some context. This country was undergoing major changes leading up to the 1950s. And Blacks in America were in transition in a number of ways. The Civil Rights Movement was in its infancy, and massive migrations of Blacks from the South were taking place. Racism, inequality, discrimination, inequity, and injustice were rampant. Institutions such as the military, state and federal governments, higher education, and some businesses were beginning to be more receptive and inclusive of Black Americans who were the predominant minority group at the time. This period of time was only 87 years after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which freed slaves in the Confederate States of America. Reconstruction was this period that followed the Civil War, and during which attempts were made to redress the inequities of slavery and its political, social, and economic legacy, and to solve the problems arising from the readmission to the Union of the 11 states that had succeeded in an effort to rebuild the South. Jim Crow laws came into existence. They were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the South. All were enacted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by white Democratic-dominated state legislatures after the Reconstruction period. The laws were enforced until 1965, when the Civil Rights Act was passed. Between 1950 and 1975, the Civil Rights Movement surged, and the consciousness of racism was awakened throughout this nation. We witnessed a similar reawakening in 2020 with the racial protest known as the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Americans have been present in Thurston County since 1845, when George Bush and his family came to the Washington Territory from Missouri. Their first choice was Oregon Territory, but because of racism and discrimination, he was not allowed to settle there and fled the consequence of a whipping due to Black exclusionary laws. Historical records refer to Bush as a mulatto or of mixed race, but he obviously was dark-skinned enough to be subjected to racial prejudice and discrimination. That is why he left Missouri, seeking a better life for himself and his family, and wound up in Thurston County. Many of us know that story of Washington's first Black pioneer family and the founding of what became known as Tumwater. A monument will soon be erected on the state capitol campus in their honor. We have also learned about Rebecca and Alexander Howard's contributions to Olympia. They arrived here in 1859. She was an outstanding hotel and restaurant owner and was one of Olympia's earliest business women. A mural is currently painted on the side of an existing building in downtown Olympia on Capitol Way, adjacent to a diamond parking lot where the Pacific House Hotel and Restaurant stood. A point along East Bay Drive has been officially named Howard Point and will be dedicated later this year with a marker in honor of the African-American couple. Other early Black settlers included James P. McQuay, a professional furrier, and James Mars, an Olympia firefighter. Aside from these individuals, little is known or written about Blacks who came to the Thurston County area since the early 1900s. Very little is included about Black Americans who resided here, particularly between early 1900s and 1950. In the changing times since World War II, there is little to no mention of Blacks in Thurston County, including in this most recent book of history, Water, Woods, and Prairies. It's as though we did not exist, and that is not the case. We just aren't included in the historical documents. The last known Blacks in Thurston County were Festus Campbell, who died in 1910, and Nathaniel Willis, who died in 1911. Records show that the Cogwell family, Margaret Carter and James Edward Cogwell, moved to Rochester in 1919 from Seattle and lived there until returning to Seattle in the mid-1950s after retiring from their large, prosperous farm. Their daughter, Ruby Cogwell Bishop, was born in Rochester in 1919 and was a renowned jazz singer and piano player until her death in 2019 in Seattle. According to census records, there were 9 Blacks and 4 mulattoes or mixed race persons in Thurston County in 1920. By 1950, there were 45, and by 1970, there were 207. The number grew to 2,864 by the 1990 census, and many more have come in the last 32 years, and subsequent census are being researched. The history of Blacks in Thurston County is very important for newer comers to understand the contributions made by many who came before them and paved the way. Opportunities began to open up for Blacks, particularly in the military. And early Blacks who came to Thurston County were part of the various branches of the service. The proximity of Fort Lewis, McCord Air Force Base, and Madigan Army Hospital began a new wave of Blacks to the Northwest and Thurston County. While not all were members of the military, Others were employees with state government, federal employees with the National Weather Service, Air Traffic Control, Olympia Brewery, early faculty and staff planners of the Evergreen State College, and other such citizens who were not well received. They blazed a trail for others who have come since 1975 and courageously led the way. The oral history project being completed will provide insight into the lives of some of these Blacks in Thurston County from 1950 to 1975. Many of these individuals have made significant contributions and served in various capacities that help make Thurston County the place it is today. For today's purpose, I will provide insight into topical themes and issues that have emerged from the interviews and archival research as we continue to compile the forthcoming book. Who were these people? Where did they come from? What did they come to? And what were their experiences during the period 1950 to 1975? The Oral Black History Project that is currently underway seeks to answer some of these questions. This period of time was chosen because many of the people identified were elderly, aging, medically fragile, and rapidly losing cognitive and recall ability. I began this project in 2010, and 75 people were originally identified as having come to Thurston County between 1950 and 1975. An outstanding work group was formed to assist with this project. Many more Blacks have since come to the area, but this cutoff year was used for practical reasons in an attempt to have a reasonable goal of completion. Of the 75 people identified, 30 have been interviewed or researched. 25 died before they could be interviewed, and 20 could not be located or existing family members identified. We are in the process of developing story narratives from the interviews and framing the content of the book that will be published by the end of this year, entitled Blacks in Thurston County, Washington, 1950 to 1975, an oral history anthology. The book cover that you see is taken from the Jacob Lawrence Migration Series, number 47, and is symbolic of Black people on the move. Our work on this project was set back by the COVID-19 pandemic, which also affected almost everything in everyone's lives this past year. Let me share with you some highlights of the themes and information that has emerged. First, the most frequently mentioned issue for those who came here in the 1950s through 1975 was that of the housing challenges due to discrimination and redlining. Finding a place to live, either buying or renting, emerged as the #1 concern when asked about their experiences when arriving in this area. Most sections of Olympia and Tumwater were off limits, and most of this wave of people settled in the northeast area of the county, Lacey and its environs, due to racially restricted covenants that have been recently discovered, real estate practices, and redlining by banks and financial institutions. Understanding these practices helps to explain why most Blacks live in the Lacey area and attend North Thurston Public Schools. Lacey was a young city and had visionary founders and developers. Racially restricted covenants were not instituted as a rule in the new city, but did exist in some nearby areas. These facts have been validated by the County Auditor's Office and an article in the Olympian, January 31st, 2021. Racial restrictions were were expressly made legal in 1926 by the US Supreme Court. The restrictions were enforceable contracts, and an owner who violated them risked property forfeiture. The covenants stated, "No other than the white race shall be allowed to occupy any residence in this subdivision except servants." This is an example of language in many discriminatory covenants still present in hundreds of local property deeds and plats in Thurston County. The authors of such covenants aimed to segregate society based on race, culture, and socioeconomic status, and they essentially succeeded given the geographical distribution of Blacks and other people of color in the county today. It remained illegal for realtors and property owners to discriminate based on race until 1968. The Housing Rights Act outlawed discrimination based on race or ethnicity in the sale or rental of housing. This change was achieved due to the hard work of many of the Blacks who came here in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, with the support of fair-minded, friendly whites. Over 377 parcels in Olympia and Tumwater exist today that still include this racially restricted language. The Thurston County Auditor's Office has launched a restrictive covenants modification outreach campaign to make direct outreach to landowners whose properties are impacted by these unlawful racially restrictive covenants. Starting in 2019, Washington property owners could record a modification document free of charge that provides notice in the land title records that a racially restrictive covenant is void and unenforceable. The Thurston County Commission passed a resolution on January 26, 2021, affirming the illegality of such language and encouraging residents to fix them. So far, no one has taken advantage of the free service offered by the county to correct these racist covenants. The second most mentioned category of experiences was that of discriminatory and prejudicial treatment in employment opportunities, in the workplace, in stores, and lots of racial profiling and other racist acts and behaviors. Even though most Blacks moving to Thurston County came with jobs or were in the military, family members experienced great difficulty in finding jobs, especially young Blacks, 16 to 21 years of age. That is still the case in many instances. The third most mentioned issue was the lack of cultural relevancy in schools. Most Black children during this period of time were small in number, and quite often the only Black student in their school or classrooms. This was coupled with the lack of Black education personnel, principals, teachers, staff, and represented significant challenges. There was a lack of commitment by school districts to hire Black staff and adopt meaningful policies to ensure a safe and equitable learning environment for Black students. Disproportionality in discipline of Black students was often mentioned. References were made, to schools in the Lacey area as being quote unquote ghetto. Rapid growth was just beginning to take place, and a few Black educators were among those coming to the area, particularly as spouses of military personnel who eventually retired in this area. The next issue of concern most mentioned was racial profiling. It has been prevalent for decades in many subtle kinds of ways. being ignored by clerks in stores, general disrespect by some people, being pulled over by law enforcement officers for very minor reasons, and other such issues ranked very high among the people in their interviews. Next was the constantly mentioned issue, the lack of opportunities for culturally relevant social interactions, especially for children, youth, and single adults. We had to create social outlets for ourselves. The book will expand on these summary issues and provide insight into the lives of Blacks in Thurston County during this period of time. Other efforts at another time and by someone else will need to close the gap between the 1920s and 1950s. Many other Black people have settled in this area since 1975, and that story also needs to be documented and told. Black history is to be acknowledged 365 days a year as an inclusive part of American and local history, and not just during the month of February when Black history is recognized nationally. We look forward to sharing the finished product with you in the near future. And we think what we will be adding to the knowledge about this group of people during this period of time will help expand everyone's knowledge about the multiculturalism of Thurston County, how people came about, and the role we are continuing to play. While I'm not going into very much detail about the individual interviews, we certainly encourage you to be on the lookout for the finished book so that you can read about these individuals. We have enjoyed the time and energy that's gone into researching, looking, interviewing, and learning, and hope that we'll be able to share this with you in a meaningful kind of way. So for the awesome team that's been a part of this project, Myrna Day, Georgie Brown, Lenore Hughes, Alice Drummer, and Ed Ecto, we appreciate the interest that has been shown in this project. So I want to thank you for your interest in joining this presentation, and I'm open to whatever comments or questions you might have, given what I just presented to you. Thank you.
Yes, there's a round of applause for you, Dr. Jackson. Thank you very much for that powerful presentation and all your information. Now that you are done with your presentation, we have time for questions and responses to you. Now, I don't see any questions in the chat as of this moment, but there might be people who would want to put in a question or comment in the chat box, or since we are kind of a small group here this afternoon, if you want to unmute yourself and direct any questions to Dr. Jackson. Otherwise, that would probably be a way to sort of stimulate our conversation with that amongst us here this afternoon. So
I have a question, Greg.
Yes, Prof.
So Thelma, what the list you mentioned of the 70 or so living people, if I got the number right, that you couldn't find 30 of them or something. Who has that list? Can we look at that list? Because we may know where some of those people are.
Yes, you can look at it. We are willing to share it. This form might not be the best way to do it.
No.
Yes, that is available, and we'll be more than glad. Any help, any assistance is more than welcome. And some of those people who died before we could get around to interviewing them, we then went to family members and children or associates,
Right.
and just began to run into a dead end on some of them. But yes, by all means, we're open to any input that anyone can give us to make this be as rounded out as possible.
And secondly, you didn't mention that Olympia was off limits during the war, but I've heard that it was. And did you have any way to verify that or not verify that? Off limits to any African-American soldiers?
No, we have no way to verify that per se. The closest thing we came to it is understanding these racially restrictive covenants that existed, and whether or not the military branches had anything to do with routing Black people in a different direction. We don't have any way to verify that. Yeah, I too heard that, but I have no way of verifying it. It was quite.
Thank you. Good job.
Dr.
Thank
Jackson, there's
Yeah.
a comment from Jill Severn.
Hi, Jill.
Um, Jill's question is this, Dr. Jackson. Thelma, can you please explain how local fair housing ordinances came to be passed and when?
They go back quite some time ago, and back in the 50s before, I would think. I don't know how far back they do go, but they were passed, and they were similar to ordinances passed in other parts of the country, and they were actually upheld by the Supreme Court. And only until the Civil Rights Movement of 1965 and fair housing laws came into place were these ordinances looked at. And they just kind of laid there for quite some time, and only until very recently.
It's gonna take forever to get this.
Have they been resurfaced to show that they are still on the books in quite a large number.
Only one of these things?
Thank you.
The next question we've got is from Ben. Dr. Jackson, what was your personal experience of Olympia and Thurston County when you arrived in 1971?
It was
Fucking
I first came to the state of Washington in Eastern Washington, in the Tri-Cities, when I came to work for the Hanford Project. So over there for 3 years, and then over to the west side of the mountain. So it was like two different worlds. But there were very few Blacks in number, and it was a different culture, a different setting entirely. And trying to maneuver the education system with 2 small children at the time, trying to understand the lay of the land. And immediately I got involved in the community, because at that time, as the racial awareness was beginning to take place, and issues of diversity was on the minds of a lot of people, you were asked to be a part of so many different things, committees, task forces. It was like virgin territory, with an interest in being a part of the community as completely as we possibly could. And so full acceptance by some people, partial acceptance by others, and no acceptance by some. And when we talk about some of the racial profiling, being tailed in retail stores, or, you know, those kinds of things, it was here. I found that. There were a lot of personal experiences I can point to, that it was nothing more than the color of my skin. No one knew anything about me, my socioeconomics, my education, or none of that, but they could look at me and see the color of my skin and perpetrate their biases towards me. And so that's been generally the experience of many, many Blacks who have come to this area, even as late as the early 70s when I came. Things have changed some, not everywhere. And in this climate in which we're living now, we're reverting back to some of that, unfortunately. But there are many more Blacks in the area now than there were in the early 70s when me and my family first came here.
Dr. Jackson, this is Merritt Long. I want to make two very quick comments and then a question. My first comment is thank you so much for an excellent presentation. You covered a tremendous amount of information in a relatively brief period of time. And number two, on behalf of my wife, Marsha, we wanted to thank both you and Nat and your family for welcoming us to Thurston County in 1974. You were the first two persons of color, Black folks that we met, and we have maintained that relationship despite Nat over the years. You know I love you, Nat. You know that. And my question is, Dr. Jackson, without trying to hold you to a particular precise date, can you just squeeze a little quantification of prior to the end of the year, you know, whether that's a November or October?
You mean as far as the publication?
Publication, yes.
Well, Mary, just having published a book yourself.
That's why I'm asking.
That is now. We're doing our level best to process up, and we are making progress. But we're just saying by the end of this year, and if that's September, November, October, we welcome that. But
I got you.
As we possibly can. There's still a lot more work to do. But we're moving right along. But thank you.
I'm not gonna pin you, huh? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Merritt. And that's the same question we've got from Joseph Mitchell. So I think you answered Joseph's question as well about your publication of your book. The next question we have is from John. Dr. Jackson, I'm interested in the use of the term mulatto to refer to George Bush in contemporary references. Why do you think this term continues to be used in modern references to Mr. Bush? And do you think it should be avoided in the future?
Well, I think it was used, and this goes way back to the 1800s, and probably way back before then even. The fact that he was referred to as a mulatto, which seems to want to take away from his Blackness, and mulatto meaning Black mixed with something else. And so the census records would indicate in a lot of instances whether you were Negro or mulatto. And so the census made that distinction. And today, in the present time, it's not used. So we're talking about biracial, mixed race, and those kinds of things. But I refer to the mulatto in this instance, just to point out that as I've heard a lot of people refer to George Bush as a mulatto, it's as though because he had some whiteness in him, he got some of the breaks that he did. But I was trying to make the point that mixed or not, he was dark-skinned enough that the whip was intended for him the same as any other Black who was trying to violate the law. So he was not such a fair-skinned mulatto that he wasn't considered a Black man. And so I hear that a lot as people around here in Thurston County talk about George Bush and the mulatto issue that comes up. Given the 400 years of slavery, you know, there are few Black folk of pure Black African anymore. And so skin color mattered. And in the case of George Bush, obviously his skin color mattered too, because he had to leave Oregon Territory to avoid being whipped because he was seen as a Black man. And so whether or not that term needs to be dropped, for the most part, it has been dropped and replaced with biracial, mixed race, and some other kinds of things. And it's more so now than it has ever been.
Great, thank you very much. That's a very helpful response.
I've got one more.
The next question. Oh, did you have something to say, Ralph?
Well, I just was going to ask, I'm sorry, I didn't want, if there's somebody else ahead of me, go ahead. Go
Oh,
ahead.
okay. Thank you, Ralph. So I've got another question from Ryan. I just want to say that this is my first Olympia Historical Society program, I think, and I love Dr. Thelma Jackson's presentation. Right. I'm a student at Evergreen and I'm very interested in history. I'm signing up as a member today. Great. thanks for putting this on, all of you. So that's a question. Thank you very much, Ryan, for those kudos. And yes, it's a great presentation. Thank you. Next is from Erica James. What is the Historical Society's plan to get this work out to younger people so they can become aware of the history of the area?
But thank you, Erica James. That happens to be my daughter from Raleigh, North Carolina.
Oh, great.
And it is part of the plans of the group working on this book to get copies in the hands of all the local libraries and in all of the schools in the school district. And we want to see or encourage that this kind of history is included when teaching about Washington state history, which is a mandate in the state of Washington. And without this kind of inclusion, students are not getting the full history picture of the state of Washington. It's not just Blacks, but it's other people of color as well. So without the inclusion of all, they are getting an incomplete history lesson on the state of Washington. So hopefully this book will add to those resources that educators will have at their disposal to help young people better understand the history of the place in which they live. Thank you, Erica.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. And I would say your question was kind of directed to the Historical Society. So I would say that part of our plan is presentations like this from Dr. Jackson, and posting this and making this available to our community. But beyond that, we need to work more on that. And I think we would like to partner with Dr. Jackson and others who are involved in her project to carry that message to greater and larger audiences throughout Olympia, Thurston County, and beyond. So good question. Thank you very much, Erica, and thanks for joining us from North Carolina. Ralph, did you want to, before I get to the next question, did you want to jump in?
I was just wondering, Thelma, about what you said, that about the number of places that language appears on the title of the property, that if they're, because of the Supreme Court rulings, and obviously it's illegal now, I'm wondering if there's some way the legislature could pass a law that would generally strike that language from the titles all across the state, because I'm sure it's way more than Thurston County. After the war, when large housing developments started taking place, I'm sure it was just routine language. And if it's still in existence, probably those people don't even know it, that it's there. And in some cases could be highly embarrassed by it.
Well, there has been some legislation along these lines, and there's a lawsuit right now. The controversy is, do you completely strike the language, or do you just modify the language? Do you preserve the historical aspect of the language, or do you eradicate it entirely and just eliminate it, and people lose sight of the fact that that was a part of our history, during this period of time. So that has been addressed, Ralph, and some activity going on around that. And we have active participation on the part of our Thurston County auditor, in paying close attention to what's going on there. But property owners have the opportunity, free of charge, to not eradicate, but to amend the language in their plats, in the covenants of their plats, so that this can be, effective. But like I said, according to Mary Hall, no one has stepped forward to avail themselves of that resource so far. It's a matter of getting the word out, sharing with people, and people coming forward with an interest in doing that. But it's just sat there for all these decades, and we'll see where it goes from there now that the focus and the attention has come to it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good point, Ralph. The next question is from Elaine. Dr. Jackson, you mentioned that the current local history book, Water, Woods, and Prairies, does not mention Blacks in Thurston County. How would you like the authors/editors to update this book to be more inclusive? I am a Thurston County Historic Commission board member and would love your input.
Well, the new history book does include some reference to Blacks in Thurston County. The other traditional George Bush, William Owens Bush, like I said, Rebecca Howard, and a few others. But so much more has taken place that involve Blacks that are not included in this book. And I pointed that out to the chair of the Thurston County Historical Society in response to a question from him. And there is interest in a reprint of this book and trying to make it more inclusive than it is. So I appreciate the acknowledgement that it did fall short in that regard. But a lot has to go into it and a lot more research than I or my work group have the capacity to do. But if it's going to be a history of Thurston County, it needs to be inclusive and need to involve all of the groups that are represented here. I commented that I really did appreciate the depth to which they looked at the indigenous people problem and the absence, because Native Americans were here before any of us, and their history is so beautiful. And they included a lot of that, and that is really appreciated. But the Black perspective and that whole period from 1900 to 1950, other than the cogwheel, just nothing. And so with us trying to pick up between 1950 and 1975 to capture some of those still living, and not to mention from 75 to the current time. So I don't know what the approach will be to try to do a second edition of that historical document to include more Blacks, but any of the material that we're coming across and any information we have to share, we are more than willing to make it available so that the new edition can be as inclusive as possible.
Thank you very much for that really great response. And Elaine adds to her message, Dr. Jackson, that she relates to you. It would be okay to respond to her privately if you want to continue that dialogue, which is very important. So just so you're aware of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, and here is another message from Ryan to Erica. I'd love to help any way that I can to bring this work to students at Evergreen. So thank you, Ryan. That would be a great offer, a great idea to do that. Lots of messages.
Can I make a comment at that point, Greg?
Yes, you can. Go ahead.
We've had great cooperation from the Evergreen State College and the archivists out there, because Evergreen came into existence in 69 and 70. So they overlapped in a few years leading up to 75. And they were able to help us identify that list of original faculty, planners, and staff who were part of the founding of Evergreen. And so they too are very interested in this project, and they're glad to see us including those early Blacks in the history of Evergreen in this book. And most of that will be archival, of course, because most of them weren't around to be interviewed. A few were. But it's very important that the presence of Blacks in the founding of Evergreen is a part of the history of Evergreen, and the history of Evergreen is important to be a part of the history of Thurston County.
And you were a board member of the board of trustees member. Yes,
for 6 or 7 years. I was even president of the board of trustees during those years that Dan was president. And so those were some good times when Evergreen always teetered back and forth as to whether or not it was going to be taken over by the state and turned into state government offices. And so as we look at Evergreen 50 some years later, it has survived that onslaught. But those were some great times, and the role of Blacks in the history of Evergreen is a very important prospect. And the president, Dr. Bridges, has been very interested in wanting to see that that history is included.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear. We've got lots of comments coming in. The next one is from Erica. a comment, I am Thelma's daughter and was deeply racially bullied throughout elementary school in the 1970s. Do you have anything to add, Thelma? Would you like to add something to that, Erica, that comment?
Erica shared that comment in her adult years. Nat and I were not aware that she was as subjected to bullying as she was. I did
Oh,
a little about one of the emergent issues had been the difficulties that Black students were faced with, you know, in the schools, being the only one, a few of them. And even when we go back to the people we interviewed in the 1950s, that was 20 years earlier than Erica. So there were even fewer. So similar kinds of stories about the conditions in which they were in, and they too become heroic given the resilience that they had to endure, and given the additional challenges as children growing up and students that other groups of students weren't subjected to. And it's amazing when we look back on people who did persevere and make it through. And even in the case of Erica, graduate of Timberline High School, she's been the first and only Lake Bear Queen in 1988. And so her resilience to all that bullying, you know, unfortunately was going on, but she and many other Black students that have come up through this area, they made it somehow in spite of the obstacles that they encountered. So thank you for Erica for sharing that with
I
this
must ask, if I may, Nat Jackson. I must say that I was aware of one case of severe bullying, and I went up and dealt with that with the principal at Lydia Hawk School at the time. And I was stunned at what Erica had endured. She'd been followed by a little kid and name called throughout a significant period of the school year. And she had told all of the appropriate individuals, the playground director and many others, or teacher, and no one dealt with it. Well, when I went up there, I went because the principal, after learning about what happened, was going to suspend Erica, because she finally caught up with the little guy since nobody did anything. And he was bending over to pick something up and she kicked him in the butt and he fell forward. And I think his head touched the ground, and that's what I dealt with. And we worked that out really well. She was not suspended and everything was put together very effectively after that. And I think the officials who had been informed of that incident really took it far more seriously. They're responsible to deal with those kind of issues, but I think they were not equipped for that. And so that's the one I learned about it, and the principal and I dealt with it very effectively.
Thank you very much, Nat, for that input. That's very instructive to hear that. Very regrettable, but thank you so much for sharing that with us. And thank you to Erica. So we've got lots of comments coming in. I'll look at I'm looking at the clock. It's about 25 after 2. We've got lots more comments that I think that Dr. Jackson is perfectly prepared to respond to and go over. So if you don't mind going beyond 2:30, you're welcome to stay with us and go through the comments. So I'll turn to the next one on the chat box. This is again from Ryan. Another comment: it would be very cool to actively and specifically invite teachers at all levels of education to watch this presentation. Yeah, thank you, Ryan. The teachers will really help put the books in people's hands. So that's another, thank you very much, Ryan. From Carolyn, great presentation, thank you. I want to make sure people of color are included in future decisions. Thank you for your insights. This is from our own Benjamin Helly. Let's see, from attendee, what is the goal of the group convening to address restrictive covenants? Is there a list of all properties with restrictive covenants? That's sort of getting to, oh, is this, I think maybe this is it's to Ralph's question about, I think Ben includes a link to the Olympian article about that. Is that correct, Ben? If you're there.
Yes, yes, I've actually added a couple, one from the Chronicle, one from Thurston County, just as some background, and they note the bill that's in the
Oh.
present legislature. I don't know the status of that at the moment, but I think it's moving ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ben, for pulling that together. Ben is great. Oh, good. From Ryan. Oh my goodness, Thelma, I didn't realize this, but I wrote about you as a member of the Thurston or of the Evergreen Board of Trustees. I worked on a historical account of the Evergreen Longhouse last summer and included a quote from one of the board meetings. You said, this quote, this project would further Evergreen's attempts in the area of cultural literacy in an important way, unquote. Honored to be with you, quote, in person, unquote, and coming full circle. Great, Ryan. That's great to hear that, coming full circle. From Sam Reed, I've got a comment. Sam Reed. Sam, do you want to join us?
Thank you, Greg. Yes. And thank you, Thelma, for the great presentation. Just kind of a tip and as you know, I was with Governor Dan Evans back in the 60s and early 70s. And Governor Evans and Jim Dollar were frustrated because blacks who they brought in the administration didn't feel weren't accepted in Olympia. Many were commuting from Tacoma, and when he found out why, he asked the woman who had chaired his re-election campaign to help put an open housing ordinance in Olympia. And then she recruited a bunch of us young tigers. And I think it was 1969, and it was adopted. So that's just a little historical factoid. And I'm glad I never crossed Erica. I wouldn't want to get kicked in the butt like that. So
Thank
And
you so
there,
much for the contribution, Sam. That's very interesting. Oh, did you have something to say, Thelma?
yes, I was going to say, and there are many stories that we'll be telling, coming from people like Jim and Mary Wilson, from Virgil Clarkson, and some others that were here in the 50s and the 60s that really chronicles just how severe that housing project was. And it was in 1969 that the change was made. But many Blacks had been enduring the impacts of those racist covenants for quite some time. Yes.
Great. Thank you again for those contributions, those responses. Another comment from Ben, who has dug up an article from the Centralia Chronicle. Thurston County still has illegal discriminatory covenants on hundreds of deeds. And includes a link to that article in the chat box if you want to track that down. I think, as we pointed out, that was probably a very common practice throughout the nation.
I had a follow-up question privately as to whether or not the county has made these parcels public, or is there a list that they can find online, or is this something that they need to contact the auditor themselves about? We'll investigate, but if anybody has that answer, we'll certainly take it.
I think making contact with the auditor's office is the way to go on that. It certainly stops short for us. We just aren't able to get into that depth of it. But some good research work has happened in the auditor's office that I'm sure they'll be more than willing to share.
And just as a follow-up, if I understand the bill correctly, that's in the legislature, there's actually going to be researchers at the University of Washington and Eastern Washington University in which they will assist with that research on when requested.
That's good to know. I wasn't aware of that. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, for that follow-up. That's great information. It looks like we're at the bottom of the questions in the chat box.
One
And
more
we're
quick-
at 2:30 according to my clock at this point on daylight savings time. So, are there any other questions that people would like to pose either in the
I've got
chat
one more.
box or just join in the conversation? You're more than welcome. These have
One
been
more.
great comments and questions. Thank you so much for this dialogue. Any others?
Yes, I got one.
Yes, Ralph.
Thelma, I just want to say thank you. You've carried this much farther than I had realized, and it's just great. Thank each member of your group too. It's really a real step forward for us. So thank you.
Thank you, Ralph, for that comment. And it's been an awesome group, and we're going to hang in here and see it to the end.
Good.
I have a question as well. Great presentation. The largest migration going on in the US these days is Black people moving back to the South. You have a daughter there now. Do you have any idea what that's about? Are people feeling more welcome there? Or is there any understood reason why this is taking place?
I think there are a number of factors related to that. And there's some good writing and some good books out there right now about that. People who migrated to the North and the West from the South some years ago, seeking better opportunities, they have found those opportunities. They've gotten their education, they've become class, and they're now interested in returning back to those lands that they left. They want to put that expertise and acquired knowledge work in the places where they grew up. They find that aside from the conditions they were fleeing, the culture and the rituals still remained a part of their lives, and they seek to return to that past. They're investing, they're becoming politically active, they're finding more job opportunities than ever before. And so it is the reverse migration. You're absolutely right. And we're seeing the political shift when people realize that the numbers are much greater, and if they organize, unite, the difference they can make. And so there's a number of reasons that contribute to it. But I think it's a glimpse of the future and what we can expect as more and more of those southern states flip their political virtue of the large numbers of Blacks that are returning.
Thank you.
Yes, great question there. Well, it's after 2:30. Before we conclude, I just want to be sure and mention, give thanks to Ben Helly of the Olympia Historical Society, Ben Bigelow House Museum, for your technical assistance with Zoom, Ben, as always, as well as your input about those covenant bill that's being introduced and those articles. And thanks also to our own Shanna Stevenson for arranging this presentation with Dr. Jackson. Thank you so much, Shanna, for all your good work, and especially to you, Dr. Jackson, for all the work you put into this presentation, as well as the work that you're doing to document Black history in Thurston County, and all your advocacy work that you've done that has been enriching our community. And again, thanks to all of you for joining us. Thanks to our members who make our programs like this possible. And we welcome you joining us in further programs that pursue this. We've got a lot of work to be done in terms of documenting Black heritage in Thurston County. And so we really welcome all the participation and working with you, Dr. Jackson, all of us together to make that happen. We talked about the book Water, Woods and Prairies, and the reprinting of that. And so there's a lot of exciting opportunities for us to do more work and do a better job at that. So unless there are any other questions or comments, we can end. But again, thank you to all of you, Dr. Jackson, and all of you for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. Nice to have you do this presentation for us.
Welcome. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Greg. Thank you.
Yeah, our pleasure. Goodbye.
Goodbye
Goodbye.
now.
I see a round of applause and wave his. There you go. Lots of thumbs up and applause. Yeah, there you go.